Hi, folks. I don't understand something on my StreamYard right now. I know this is not of obvious concern to you, but it's showing me. Oh, I see what it's doing. It's showing me minutes. I got a little panicked. I thought for a minute it was showing me the hours I've been on. That's it. Okay, everything's okay. Everything's all right. Hi, Steve. Hi, Stacy. Hi, Kay. And hi, Dolores. And thank you all for being here. There's probably a lot of competition tonight, but please do your best to share for me. Facebook seems to have made it more difficult to share to groups again. So I wasn't able to do too much of that. Anyway, here I am. And tonight what I want to talk about is the politics of trying to legislate the COVID relief bill, and specifically filibusters, and of course the reconciliation alternative. And I want to go through a number of commentaries on it and comment on the commentaries. So, the first piece I'll share with you is one by Robert Reich. A lot of people like the Robert Reich. I like him too, but I often don't like what he has to say. You will see why in a few minutes. So the title of his piece from The Guardian is Why Republicans Won't Agree to Biden's Big Plans and Why He Should Ignore Them. I do like that. I do agree with that. This post was put in on January 31st. There's a picture of Biden with a jacket over his shirt and then a suit coat over that. I don't see the logic of that one, frankly. I suppose if you're going to wear a jacket, you might as well wear a jacket, right? If there were ever a time for bold government, it's now, says Reich. COVID, joblessness, poverty, raging inequality, and our last chance to preserve the planet are together creating an existential inflection point. I agree with that. Fortunately for America and the world, Donald Trump is gone. Joe Biden has big plans for helping Americans survive COVID and then restructuring the economy, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, and creating millions of green jobs. And Reich then says, but Republicans in Congress don't want to go along. Why not? Why not? Well, Mitch McConnell and others say America can't afford it. We just passed a program with $900 billion in it, groused Senator Mitt Romney, the most liberal of the bunch. I think that's the Republican bunch he's talking about there. And he says, rubbish. We can't afford not to. Fighting COVID will require far more money. People are hurting. Simply stated, correct. Good, all good. Besides, with the economy in the doldrums, it's no time to worry about the national debt. I don't think it's ever time to worry about the level of the national debt. And I wish that Reich would become alive to that. I wish he would read some MMT. I wish he would read at least The Deficit Myth. the idea that this is no time to worry about the national debt because the economy is very badly off, that's a trope used by old-style progressives. And then the next sentence is another trope of that kind. The best way to reduce the debt as a share of the economy is to get the economy growing again. No, that is not the best way to reduce the debt. Not that I don't want the economy to begin to grow again. I certainly do. I'd like to see jobs for people again. I'd like to see activity much greater than it is today. But I don't think that's the best way to reduce the debt as a share of the economy. I think the best way to reduce the debt, because it's the quickest way to reduce the debt as a share, okay, of the economy, and in absolute terms also, is for the federal government to pay it off when it comes due. They can do that without raising taxes, and they can do that without causing inflation. That will not in itself cause inflation. Repairing, I'm going on with what Reich has to say, repairing aging infrastructure, and building a new energy efficient one will make the economy grow even faster over the long term, further reducing the debts per share. So what he's saying there is that, okay, you look at the debt, okay, the debt's a particular size, okay. If the economy grows faster than the debt, then that means that the fraction, the debt to GDP ratio, is getting smaller. So he's looking to make the economy grow even faster over the long term than the debt grows. But what he's also telling you is that the way he wants to do that is by deficit spending and issuing debt instruments on a one-to-one basis, dollar-wise, with the deficit spending. And he won't acknowledge that that is not necessary, that you can use trillion-dollar coins, or you can use overt congressional financing. Two ways for the monetary sovereign of the United States to simply spend money without either issuing corresponding debt and without also taxing, if there's no need to tax. So he doesn't even acknowledge that he knows that these things can be done. Where has he been for the last 10 years when the ideas of MMT have been spreading? It's no longer a really small group that knows about MMT. By now, must be hundreds of thousands of people who know that there is such a thing, okay, as MMT, and who know some of the things, okay, it says. So why can't Reich simply acknowledge the existence, okay, of MMT? He doesn't have to agree with MMT. But when he writes about something like this, it certainly should be mentioned. And the ways that it has highlighted to reduce the debt should also be mentioned. If he wants to argue that he thinks a better way to reduce the debt is simply to grow the economy, I'd be interested in hearing that argument. But I think that a degree of honesty from an intellectual point of view would suggest that he ought to be talking about that. Anyway, repairing aging infrastructure and building a new energy efficient one will make the economy grow even faster over the long term, further reducing the debt share. No one in their right mind should worry that public spending will, quote, crowd out, quote unquote, but private investment. If you hadn't noticed, borrowing is especially cheap right now. He says money is sloshing around the world in search of borrowers. Well, those borrowers have to have when they sell debt instruments, specifically the government selling debt instruments, needs the dollars out there, and people holding those dollars willing to buy the debt instruments. So it's not just money in general that has to be sloshing around the world. It has to be dollars that are sloshing around the world if you want to sell debt instruments. Now, that doesn't mean that public spending is going to crowd out private investment. And the reason why not is because if people want to invest, there's no loanable funds market that it gets those dollars from. If people want to take loans out in order to invest, they can do that without the federal government having to issue any more dollars. Why not? Because loans from banks create deposits for the borrowers. The private banks, commercial banks, are creating money when people borrow money from them to invest. There's no such thing as crowding out private investment, public spending crowding out private investment. By this time, Bob Reich should know that. He shouldn't be filling people's heads with nonsense that will later be used by the austerity mongers and by the CBO, who still thinks crowding out private investment is a thing. Crowding out private investment is not a thing. There's no danger of that. But not because money is sloshing around the world. There's no danger of that because loans create the deposits. There's no loanable funds market out there that's ready to run dry. It's hard to take Republican concerns about debt seriously when just 4 years ago, they had zero qualms about enacting one of the largest tax cuts in history, largely for big corporations and the super wealthy. If they really don't want to add to the debt, there's another alternative. They can support a tax on super wealthy Americans. And there again, there's another statement, which is off. Yes, they can support a tax on super wealthy Americans, but they also can support using trillion-dollar coins if they don't want to add to the debt, or using $100 trillion coin if they don't want to add to the debt. or using overt congressional financing. Again, if Reich was intellectually honest, he would call attention to these other alternatives. Taxing and borrowing are not the only two alternatives. Reich is giving the impression here that they are. That's what I don't like about his writing. He's such a 1990s progressive. The year is 2021. The total wealth of American 660 billionaires has grown by a staggering 1.1 trillion since the start of the pandemic, a 40% increase. They alone could finance almost all of Biden's COVID relief package and still be as rich as they were before the pandemic. So why not a temporary emergency COVID wealth tax? Well, if you raised 1.1 trillion from them through taxation, first of all, that 1.1 trillion would not pay for anything. What pays for stuff is Congress appropriating the money. So Congress still has to appropriate that 1.1 trillion. Furthermore, Biden's program, his relief bill, is pegged at 1.9 trillion, though nobody really knows because the bill is not out yet. But he's been advertising it as a $1.9 trillion bill. So the 660 billionaires would not be able to be taxed for the $1.9 trillion without their having a reduction in the wealth they had at the start of the pandemic. So let's be honest about that. If we wanted to do this through taxation, we would have to take the full $1.9 trillion but from them, removing their gains from the start of the pandemic, plus an additional $800 billion. They would fight hard not to have to do that. Yes, they could finance all of Biden's relief package, but they wouldn't be as rich as they were before the pandemic. So, I thought that was worth at least some commentary. Now, next, I think I certainly agree with the real reason Republicans want to block Biden is they fear his plans would work. It would be the Republicans' worst nightmare. All the anti-government claptrap they've been selling since Ronald Reagan will be revealed as nonsense. Government isn't the problem and never was. Bad government is the problem, and Americans have just had 4 years of it. No, Robert, Americans have had 40 years of it, because even though you don't want to say so, there was 8 years of bad government under Bill Clinton. And there was another 8 years of bad government under Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And of course, there was 12 years of bad government under Reagan and the first Bush. And another 8 years of bad government under Bush 43. And another 4 years of bad government under Donald Trump. So we've had 40 years of bad government so far. Okay, the last time we had a decent government, and I wasn't too happy with that one either, was Jimmy Carter. You have to say one thing for Carter. At least he was trying to do some good things for people as opposed to good things for donors. Yeah, he was. Biden's success would put into sharp relief Trump and Republicans' utter failures on COVID, jobs, poverty, inequality, and climate change, and everything else. And that's also pretty true, not just of Trump and the Republicans, but of Democrats over the last 40 years, too. Biden and the Democrats would reap the political rewards in 2022 and beyond. Democrats might even capture the presidency and Congress for a generation. They might. After FDR rescued America, the Republican Party went dark for 2 decades. Well, not exactly. I'm not sure when he counts that from. But if he's counting the period 1933 to 1953 as the 20 years, as the 2 decades, first of all, I don't think that FDR actually rescued America overnight. I think there were a lot of tough years before the rescue of America. Okay. And I don't think the Republican Party was dark beginning in 1953. I don't want to quibble, but I remember a presidency that they had between 1953 and early 1961. 2 rather popular presidencies. Not overwhelmingly successful either, I don't think, but there are a lot of people who look back to the 50s as some kind of benchmark of good feeling and prosperity and so on. I would call that into question, but that's a subject for another live stream. Trumpian Republicans in Congress have an even more diabolical motive for blocking Biden. They figure if Americans remain in perpetual crises and ever-deepening fear, they'll lose faith in democracy itself. I'm sorry, Bob. I think that's already happened. I think that's part of the reason for what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, don't you? This would open the way for another strongman demagogue in 2024, if not Trump, a Trump impersonator like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, or Donald Trump Jr. If Biden is successful, Americans' faith in democracy might begin to rebound, marking the end of the nation's flirtation with fascism. Well, it all depends, of course, on what we mean by successful. And Bob then tells us if he helps build a new economy of green jobs with good wages, even Trump's angry white working class base might come around. They might. The worst kept secret in Washington is Biden doesn't really need Republicans anyway. With their razor-thin majorities in both houses of Congress, the Democrats can enact Biden's plans without a single Republican vote. Yes, but unfortunately, those razor-thin majorities require that he needs all of the Democratic votes, including from people like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. The worry is Biden wants to demonstrate, quote, bipartisan cooperation, unquote, and may try so hard to get some Republican votes that his plans get diluted to the point where Republicans get what they want. Failure. And Bob says Biden should forget bipartisanship. Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans didn't give a hoot about bipartisanship when they and Trump were in power. He's right. Completely right about that. If Republicans try to stonewall Biden's COVID plan, Biden and the Democrats should go it alone through a maneuver called reconciliation, allowing a simple majority to pass budget legislation. If Republicans try to block anything else, Biden should scrap the filibuster, which now requires 60 senators to end the debate. It's not in the Constitution, he points out. It can be ended by a simple majority vote by the nuclear option, and of course he's right about that. Then he points out Biden will have to twist the arms of a few recalcitrant Democrats but that's what presidential leadership often requires, and that is right as well. But that's not easy. It's not so easy. The multiple crises engulfing America are huge. The window of opportunity for addressing them is small. If ever there was a time for boldness, it is now. And I completely agree with that. I don't mean to be so sour on what was written by Bob Reich here. I do agree with the overall posture, of course, but I thought it was important to call out some of the problems in how this type of Democrat, this type of a progressive, that frames things, and to point out why that framing, while it might be okay in the short run, in the long run can come back to bite us. I've pointed that out constantly over the last 10 years. I'm getting a little tired of it because I'm still getting that kind of crappy framing from most of the publications and blogs of the progressives. Though notably, there are a considerable lesser number of people framing things in this way than was the case when I first got involved with MMT in the last part of 2009 and the early part of 2010. So let me go to the second one of our things here. Please do share. We still are not getting very much, too many people here to help us out. So there was this interesting piece in The Week by Ryan Cooper. There's no bipartisanship because Republicans don't want it. And that's another attack on the bipartisan trope. This was from today, February 22nd. And he talks about the 10 Republican senators who went to see the president on Monday and says if Biden knows what's good for him, this will be a simple feint to get some positive press. He almost certainly would not be able to get 10 votes, even for a pared-down version of his bill. Yes, because if it follows the pattern that was followed in 2009, after they meet with him and after they get him to cut down the bill and after they get him to make it real small, so he fails, and so the Democrats fails, if they're stupid enough to pass that bill, they likely will get no Republican votes for it. No Republican votes. I think they got one Republican vote, or at the most two, for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus bill in 2009, if I recall. And after getting all kinds of objections from the Republicans on the health care reform, they didn't get even a single Republican vote for the Affordable Care Act when it finally passed. A Republican plan that came out of the American Heritage Foundation. Not a single Republican would vote for a Democratic equivalent of that plan. Why? Because it carried the label Democratic. It was all about making Obama fail, not about doing anything for the American people. But I got to give them credit for that, because they got Obama to collaborate, and he failed. His presidency was over right then, for all the good the rest of it did for us. Anyway, among the group are several hard-right conservatives who will be extremely reluctant to vote for anything that Biden supports, says Ryan Cooper. So if he agrees to it, to them, it will become bad by definition. Of course. It's bad now. They're just faking. How serious is Biden about bipartisanship? But wonders Politico. He should, quote, choose compromise, writes Michael R. Strain at Bloomberg. They all want Biden to fail. They want him to be hamstrung for the rest of his presidency as soon as possible. It's therefore key to understand that the Republicans are not actually trying to negotiate in any kind of ordinary sense. They're trying to sabotage Biden's presidency and manipulate the media. So long as the GOP remains a party of conspiracy-mongering insurgents trying to overthrow democracy, there can be no real bipartisanship. I think that's wisdom, folks. That's wisdom. Total wisdom. As long as this quasi-fascist party, or maybe just outright fascist party, is just trying to overthrow democracy, how can there be real bipartisanship? But I have to say, the only time I've noticed, there are only two different times, two different kinds of times when I've noticed any bipartisanship. There are the times when Democrats and Republicans get together to hold hands while they pass a bill they know will be unpopular with the American people. That was standard operating practice during the Clinton administration and during the Bush administration and during the Obama administration. That's what they would do. They would hold hands, be bipartisan, pass crappy bills that did no good for the American people, like NAFTA, like marching into Iraq, like all the other terrible things they did. So that was one type of bipartisanship. I remember another type of bipartisanship too. I remember when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that was passed with bipartisan votes. Why was that passed with bipartisan votes? Because the Republicans in those days were clearly the subordinate party. And in part, they were a party that claimed to be favorable to civil rights. And so they had to prove that. They had to do something good because at the time, in the 1963 to 65 period, they were still seeking black votes. And remember, at that time and before, since the Civil War, they were the party of Lincoln. Many blacks were still voting for Republicans in 1960 and still willing to listen in 1964 and still willing to listen in 1968 when Nixon turned away from them. I'll always remember that Jackie Robinson was a Republican. Anyway, consider a common type of bargaining, haggling over price. Suppose I want to buy a used car for $1,500, but its owner wants to sell it for $2,000. We thus meet at the middle at $1,750. Now, in order for this to happen, I must express a preference so we can figure out an acceptable compromise or decide we're too far apart to agree. These Republicans are not carrying out their half of the negotiation ritual. They simply took what Biden wants and lopped off more than two-thirds without so much as a whisper of serious justification, cutting the $1,400 direct assistance checks to $1,000. When they should have been $2,000, by the way, Biden pre-compromised with himself and broke a promise and put them at $1,400. He broke an explicit promise he made on January 3rd and January 4th in the run-up to the January 5th elections in Georgia. I mean, there's video on him promising the $2,000. So he pre-compromised to $1,400, and then they figured Since this ass pre-compromised, why don't we just ask him to compromise a little more and go down to 50% of what he promised? That'll get people real mad at him. Going on. And further limiting who would receive them, cutting the boost to unemployment insurance by $100 and making it 3 months shorter, and slicing out the $15 minimum wage and aid to state and local government entirely. This latter omission should be a complete deal breaker by itself. Look, I think any of those other things are a complete deal breaker. Slicing out the $15 minimum wage, that was a promise Biden made in the campaign. Going against that would have been a deal breaker. The aid to state and local government, yeah, that's a deal breaker. He promised that too. He didn't promise $300 in unemployment insurance extensions. He promised more. So all they wanted him to do was to break multiple promises that he made in the campaign. Come on, Joe, make a deal with us. Break 4 different promises you made. Whereas the Biden administration has a lengthy justification for every item in its package. And again, if anything, it is too small. These Republican senators, yes, Ryan Cooper, who knows some MMT, is saying the package is too small at $1.9 trillion. That's better than Joe Stiglitz was willing to do when he was talking to Mehdi Hassan today on Mehdi's program. Joe Stiglitz wanted the $1.9 trillion bill, but he didn't say, if anything, it is too small. So I give credit to Ryan for doing that. Quote, these Republican senators have only expressed some vague, phony, baloney worries about the deficit. Quote, again, the additional stimulus checks the president is proposing are not well targeted, unquote, complained Senator Susan Collins, a sentiment that was oddly absent when she voted for Trump's deficit exploding tax cuts for the rich in 2017. Anyway, what Ryan says is that a real negotiation would start with Republicans' actual substantive objections to specific parts of the bill or some kind of trade they wanted to make. They might say they want even more tax cuts for the rich or a particular piece of pork for their home states. In the latter case, they would probably get what they wanted. Biden would no doubt be more than happy to hand out some highway funding or whatever to get that shiny bipartisan imprimatur. But that is completely impossible so long as Republicans don't say what they really want. And they don't do that because their political goals, insofar as they have any at all, are purely destructive. And that is Ryan's point. So I'm not going to go through the rest of this, but he's making the case extremely well that what this group is doing is trying to trick Biden into cutting down the size of his pandemic rescue package so he cannot get credit for fixing the economy, trying to trick the media into blaming their inevitable refusal to compromise on Biden instead of themselves. Even better if it distracts from the ongoing plot to rig future elections with extreme gerrymandering at the state level. So Ryan makes the point, essentially, that bipartisanship is simply BS, that it's a shiny object, and he finishes with this by saying, quote, at any rate, for whatever reason, Biden felt the need to pander to this sentiment during the campaign by promising a return to bipartisan comity that was absolutely never going to happen. He duly gave Republicans their opening, and now that they rejected the offer, it's on them. But perhaps now Democrats could try the novel strategy of trying to do a good job all by themselves and allowing Republicans and allowing voters, I should say, to judge them on their performance. That's what bipartisanship is all about, really. It's about parties seeking um, 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 lack of accountability and being able to say if something goes wrong, well, they supported us too. It was bipartisan. That's what bipartisanship is about. It's about frightened politicians wanting to not be accountable. So let's look now at Dave Dayen's take on all of this. He had a few nice things to say, too. This is from the first 100 column, and today. The Senate filibuster is actively harming COVID relief policy. Absolutely right. But of course, it's not only harmed COVID relief policy, the filibuster harmed the stimulus bill in 2009. Why do you think the stimulus bill couldn't be more than $1 trillion? Because Obama was seeking bipartisanship for the stimulus bill. Why was he seeking bipartisanship? Because he wanted to pass the stimulus bill. He wanted to pass the stimulus bill with 60 votes. The filibuster was harmed the stimulus bill, prevented a rapid recovery, cost the economy trillions of dollars between 2009 and 2016. Trillions of dollars. Trillions of dollars the filibuster cost us when it was not worth the job of a single American. I wrote that in 2009 in the run-up to the passage of the stimulus bill. Dave says, 6 more weeks of winter. Sorry, the groundhog says so. Democrats don't want to experience 2009 Groundhog Day all over again, which is why, despite the 2-hour meeting in the White House between Biden and the Republicans Monday night, they're moving forward on budget reconciliation for the COVID rescue bill. I noted yesterday that Democrats may have a path to get the entire bill, including the increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour, through the reconciliation process, because increasing the minimum wage has significant budget effects. I mentioned there was a forthcoming research paper that would show a $65 billion annual savings to the federal budget from this wage hike. The paper came out yesterday afternoon. It was from Michael Reich. I have no idea whether he's any relation to Robert Reich. At the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, at Berkeley. So not only do they have the connection of last names, they have the connection of a strong interest in the labor market, and they have a connection that they're both from University of California at Berkeley. Isn't that interesting? I'll check later to see if he is Bob Reich's son. Anyway, specifically, we found $65.4 billion per year in savings through a combination of increased tax revenue on higher wages and reduced federal expenditures on safety net programs due to eligibility of the thresholds. The $65.4 billion in savings is full implementation 2025. So for a score of the fiscal impacts of the minimum wage increase over the 10-year budget window, 2021 to 2030, the total would not be just 65.4 times 10. I don't have my fancy calculator on hand, but back of the envelope math says this would have a fiscal impact of close to $500 billion. I don't have my fancy calculator on hand either, so I'll just do it off the top of my head. I agree with them. It would be close to $500 billion. Okay. An Economic Policy Institute today backs up Reich's research. It gives a range of savings for the budget between $27 billion and $65 billion, the top end of which is consistent with what Reich had to say. I should say at this point, this is not necessarily a good outcome. Increased taxes on higher wages still puts a worker out ahead, to be sure, but reductions in federal benefits could create a treadmill effect, with the government taking away what the private sector is forced to pay out, as $15 an hour isn't really a living wage in much of the country. Clawing back benefits isn't a perfect scenario. It is, however, good because it lets you pass the wage hike with 50 votes. That's the massive positive in its favor. And it shows the distorting impact of the Senate filibuster on public policy debates. We're sitting here rooting for workers to earn out of food stamps because it's the only way for them to get a raise. You could always backfill this by recalculating the measure of poverty to make more people eligible for food stamps and other benefits. But this isn't the only way where using budget reconciliation leads to harmful effects. There's a law called the Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010, which creates a process for automatic cuts when the government creates new spending without offsetting it. Congress has done a lot of that in the past year, but every COVID relief package contained a rider that waived the Budget Act, thereby eliminating the automatic cuts. However, you can only waive the Budget Act with 60 votes in the Senate. If you use budget reconciliation, you can't waive it. That's the rule for reconciliation, okay, budget reconciliation. Now, of course, Democrats can redraw the budget reconciliation rules. They have 50 plus 1. They can restructure the rule. Okay, now the Republicans can try to filibuster that, but if they try to filibuster it, then Democrats can simply say, and probably in that scenario, they could probably force Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to vote for the end of the filibuster altogether. And then they wouldn't have to worry about budget reconciliation. They could just pass it with 51 votes. I think that's the strategy they should follow, folks. I think that would be even better than giving Bernie the satisfaction of using reconciliation. I know he wants that satisfaction. He's been rubbing his hands together over using budget reconciliation to save people, to do something good for people, rather than, like the Republicans did, use it to do bad things. Therefore, a large package using reconciliation, says Dave, would trigger the cuts, which would fall on mandatory spending like the Medicare program, farm subsidies, and more. That actually happened on the Trump tax cuts, but Democrats joined Republicans to avert $25 billion in cuts to Medicare. I doubt Republicans would return the favor now, though Democrats would probably love to hold that vote so they could say that Republicans are responsible for cutting Medicare. However, Republicans, of course, would say the same thing because the reconciliation process created the problem in the first place. Dave says this does argue for a checks and shots strategy, by the way. If you get what you could get quickly with 60 Senate votes, you can waive the Budget Act in that package. You know, I think my idea is better. You approach this by trying to change the reconciliation rules. Have the Republicans filibuster that, then use the nuclear option. Because I think Sinema and Manchin could be brought along with that kind of strategy to get rid of the filibuster, because I think they would be outraged if this were done right. If this were done right. If you use the right justification for changing the reconciliation process. And the Republicans filibustered it. I think a threat to get rid of the filibuster in that context would be very credible. And the Republicans would end up, well, probably what would happen is the Republicans would end up folding like a cheap suit, and the Democrats would be able to have the reconciliation rules they wanted in order to pass the reconciliation bill they wanted to pass. So probably that's what would happen. But if it wouldn't happen, then maybe we could get rid of the filibuster. And then that would be the best thing that could happen. So that's something a Democrat should try right now, tomorrow. Anyway, Dave says fully articulated checks and shots could be half the $1.9 trillion package. Yeah, I think it could be $1 trillion even, more than half. Even Senate Republicans are offering $600 billion. Then you could do the rest in reconciliation. And if the aforementioned minimum wage hike scores as saving $500 billion, you'd wipe out a lot of that fiscal impact. That at least would minimize any Medicare cuts while getting checks and vaccine money out quickly. That's a pretty good scheme, I agree. But I think what I just suggested might be a little better. But anyway, of course, we have to step back and say this whole thing is absurd because of an artificial supermajority threshold that sprung from an accidental deletion to the Senate rules. Congress has to think about enacting bad policy so good policy can be enacted. The whole thing can be avoided by just allowing majority rule, which is good enough for practically every government on earth. Our obsession with the filibuster is actively harming our people. Yes, I said before, it harmed us with respect to the stimulus bill in 2009. It harmed us with respect to the healthcare reform bill. Without the filibuster and the need for 60 votes, we surely could have gotten a much better healthcare reform bill in 2009. It probably wouldn't have been enough because Obama was dead set on saving the health insurance companies. He was dead set on saving that. But first, he would have been exposed as being against Medicare for all, which would have certainly helped. And secondly, he would have undoubtedly been forced to pass what he advocated for during the campaign, specifically a public option. That at least would have been better than the junky Affordable Care Act we still have today. Do you know how many lives were lost between 2010 and 2016 because the Affordable Care Act was passed as opposed to Medicare for all? I do. I estimated that myself at 356,000 Americans who did not have to die. That does not include any financial penalties of that egregious political strategy of Barack Obama, who, by the way, I think was a pretty terrible president. I'm sorry if you liked him. I think he was a pretty terrible president. The absurdity, who was interested in getting rich after he ended the presidency. That's why he acted the way he did. I'm telling you, he was following the Clinton model. He wanted to be another Clinton. And that's what he is. Another Clinton, making a fortune. Family, making a fortune. That's what he was about. He wasn't about us. He was about his family. The absurdity is particularly acute during a national emergency, where these questions of how to end run the filibuster are happening while thousands are dying daily. Millions are at the edge of the financial cliff, and we're in a race with infectious variants that will resurge the COVID cases and deaths. Why are we wasting our time with clever concepts to get things passed with a simple majority instead of just passing everything with a simple majority? I remind you again, Obama had 58 Senate seats after the election of 2008. When he came into office, he had 58 Senate seats. If he had nuked the filibuster right then, or gotten Harry Reid to nuke the filibuster right then, he could have lost 8 conservative votes and still passed the stimulus bill he wanted, the healthcare reform bill he wanted. He would have had enough support from the population to pass any green bills he wanted to pass, any education bills he wanted to pass, any financial system reform bills he wanted to pass. That's how bad a president Obama was. Really bad. He could have done all the things that we needed then, and we would not now have a case where in the middle of a pandemic and we have to play around with the filibuster and reconciliation rather than being able to pass things through a majority vote in both houses of Congress. Dave ends saying how there appears to be wiggle room on the eligibility threshold for the $1,400 checks, though not the size. Says it would be a mistake to tighten eligibility, but a bigger one to make arbitrary cuts to direct payments, which, by the way, he's already made. Dave has to start making that point. The public, if they matter, is all on the side of getting something big done and using whatever process, including reconciliation, to do it. And when you have West Virginia Governor Jim Justice saying publicly that there's no need to skip, Jim Justice, the Trumpist, Joe Manchin's governor, there's no need to skimp, including on checks, when, quote, people are really hurting, unquote. Jim Justice sounds like Chuck Schumer, is a laser shot right at Joe Manchin and the rightmost wing of the Democratic Party. There's no reason to deviate the course. And I completely agree with what Dave had to say about that, of course. Next. Here's an encouraging piece by somebody from The Week, by David Farris, how ending the filibuster could actually foster bipartisanship. And I'm going to skip through most of this and come to the end. And most of it, okay, is history. And I'll start with, quote, "This all seems quite dumb when you step back and think about it," the history he reviewed. What if Senate majorities were simply allowed to pass legislation, which is the way it works in every other legislative body on the planet? While the U.S. two-party system is rare, supermajority requirements are not a feature of other presidential democracies. for example, Mexico, nor are they found in parliamentary systems like Canada or the UK. What if no one in the minority party believed they could use the filibuster rule to obstruct and humiliate their opponents and instead could only negotiate in good faith with their counterparts to craft laws? The guess here is that it would open up some space for governing parties to produce bills that have some support from the opposition. Under the filibuster rule, the minority's chief obligation is to keep the caucus voting together to obstruct the majority's agenda. The moderates, who might otherwise be inclined to band together with their counterparts across the aisle, instead see nothing but the possibility of getting back into power in the next election. It's a zero-sum game, so long as obstruction pays. And people like Collins and Murkowski will typically only defy leadership when their votes are not needed, when the party leader has released them, quote unquote, to take a vote that might play better in their home states. The really critical way to think about filibuster reform is this: it takes control of the Senate agenda out of the hands of the minority leader. Remember, obstruction works not by producing resentment against single-party rule, but rather by creating the widespread perception that the president's party isn't getting anything done. I think this is very good reason here. If you vaporize the utility of obstruction by nuking the filibuster, you simultaneously free moderates from the grip of party leadership and empower them to work together as a small but crucial bipartisan bloc with effective veto power over legislation. Democrats have the chance to change the national political environment for the better, not just to improve their own odds in 2022 midterms and to make Joe Biden's reelection more likely by passing popular reform, but to end the tyranny of the supermajority, empower both parties' moderates to work together, and to usher this era of ugly paralysis out the door. If they fail to do so, the Senate will continue masquerading as the site of compromise, when in reality, it is where good ideas and bipartisan cooperation go to die. The only thing you should have added there is, except in the case when the bipartisan cooperation is for the purpose of screwing the public. In other words, it's where good ideas and good ideas involving bipartisan cooperation go to die, but where bad ideas involving bipartisan cooperation go to live, to pass, because that's what happens too. So, that ends that one. Then, the next one, moving right along here, is a piece from Common Dreams. Let me share that for you. And this is not by one of their regulars. It is. I'm sorry. It's by Jessica Corbett, who is one of their regular writers. As GOP senators push smaller COVID-19 relief package, Dem leaders move to advance Biden's bolder plan. And there's Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer walking along together. And what they've done, of course, is file a resolution, a budget resolution, a joint budget one for fiscal year 2021, giving Congress an additional tool to pass relief legislation. A $1.9 trillion proposal he unveiled before taking office last month. In other words, that would be the reconciliation bill for the American Rescue Plan. And she explains that if it's a reconciliation bill, it can't be blocked by a filibuster, only needs majority support to get to Biden's desk. And some people are quoted some tweets, okay, quoted. I'll skip through them, okay, and get to what Schumer said. He could quote, Congress must pursue a bold and robust course of action. It makes no sense to pinch pennies when so many Americans are struggling, unquote. So wasn't Jim Justice practically quoting Chuck Schumer? What's going on here? Quote, the only thing we cannot accept is a package that is too small or too narrow to pull our country out of this emergency, unquote. And quote again, we cannot repeat the mistake of 2009. And we must act very soon to get this assistance to those so desperately in need. Schumer says there's nothing in the process that precludes our work from becoming bipartisan. If Republicans want to contribute to it, they can contribute to it. Meanwhile, at the White House, when asked whether going big or going bipartisan is more important to the president, Press Secretary Jen Psaki pushed back and said, well, I think the president believes we can, and there's historic evidence. It's possible to take a number of paths, including through reconciliation, if that's the path that is pursued, and for the vote to be bipartisan. And she, of course, is right about that. She's right about that. But, of course, the press wants to say it's not bipartisan unless the Republicans get what they want. Unless the Biden proposal is defeated and he fails and the Republicans get a chance to come back in 2022, it's not really bipartisan. That's what CNN is really telling you. That's what MSNBC is really telling you. They got to be bipartisan. As for Biden's meeting with GOP senators, she said it's part of the president and administration close and ongoing engagement with members of both parties. And Jen Psaki says it's important to remember, she added, the size of the package was designed with the size of the crisis. Dual crises. Yes, the economic crisis and the pandemic. Well, progressives are calling for reconciliation to be used and not to worry about bipartisanship. And Jayapal, of course, went that way with some broad statements. Bernie Sanders went that way. And Bernie, of course, said, what we're saying is, quote, you used it, specifically reconciliation, for that. That's fine. That is for massive tax breaks for the rich and large corporations. We're going to use reconciliation, that is 50 votes in the Senate plus the vice president, to pass legislation desperately needed by working families in this country right now. Quote, you did it, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it to protect ordinary people, not just the rich and the powerful, unquote. And that's the end of that one. So there's another one from Common Dreams. This one was January 31st. This is a longer piece by Eric Levitz, which had some really good things to say. I'm going to kind of skip to those things. Here's a little thing. As a constitutional matter, Senate majorities boast sovereignty over their chamber. Even if Democrats were to acquiesce to McConnell's demand, it would have remained within their power to change the rules on a party line basis later in the term. Yeah, Democrats can change the rules anytime they want to. But surrender would have made pulling such an about face a tad more politically difficult. More importantly, It would have made it harder for Schumer to wield the threat of filibuster abolition as a cudgel in the negotiations with Republicans over Biden's legislative agenda. Joe Manchin, for his part, seemed to understand this, as Reuters reported last week. Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin favor keeping the legislative filibuster. But even Manchin supports Schumer sticking to his guns and not making any promises to McConnell, keeping the threat of going nuclear on legislation in reserve if Republicans do not work in a cooperative way. Quote, Chuck has the right to do what he's doing, unquote, said Manchin to reporters this week. He has the right to use that to leverage in whatever he wants to do, unquote. Yet, on Monday night, Manchin appeared to take the leverage out of Schumer's hands by voicing unconditional, unequivocal support for preserving the filibuster. By the way, Manchin has some wiggle room there, which is important to point out. Let's say that Schumer came to Manchin and said, okay, you've said that you're going to keep the filibuster. What about changing it back to the old filibuster, where if they don't like something, they got to get up, okay, and they got to filibuster, actually talk, follow the old rules. What about getting rid of the current rules where just making an objection is considered a filibuster? And by the way, is kept as an anonymous filibuster. What about making it public again and making them work for it? If Manchin agreed to that kind of change in the rules, and agreed to nuking the filibuster over rules changes to make that happen, that alone would be enough to change the complexion of the Senate. It would stop the Republicans from blocking popular bills. The record for a filibuster by a single person is only, after all, 24 hours, a little more than 24 hours. It keeps the filibuster, but if a single person could only delay by 24 hours. Now, there has been a case in the civil rights case, actually the 24-hour was in the civil rights case of 1957, but in connection with the civil rights bill of, I forget if it was 64, 65, but in that case, there was a delay rights bill of 60 days because the Southern Democrats were so set on having the racist system continue that they were willing to go for 60 days. But eventually they failed. Now, the same leverage would not be there to block the $1.9 trillion plan, okay, of Biden. First of all, the Republicans would all have to be coming out against the $1,400 checks, or if Biden is wise, he'll let Sanders raise that to $2,000 checks, if he's wise. But if that were the situation and the Republicans tried to filibuster, they would pay in 2022. They would pay one hell of a price, because they would have to delay this for, well, they wouldn't be able to delay it for weeks on end. They'd fold. Even if they delayed it for a few days and the filibuster was on television and on YouTube for days and days with them arguing faux fiscal responsibility and getting back counter arguments on that, they would pay through the nose in 2022. I think McConnell, again, would fold like a cheap suit in that kind of a scenario. But no, I'm all for getting rid of it altogether. I don't even want to do that. Let it be gone. It has hurt the United States so much over the years. Let us just not hear about it anymore. It's so terrible. For Democrats who would prefer for their party to not squander its first chance to govern in a decade, and or last chance to avert our descent into semi-permanent minority rule, hope now lies in the incoherence of Manchin's position. If the West Virginia senator is as unconditionally opposed to altering the filibuster as his recent remarks suggest, then it is not clear why he supported Schumer holding the line against McConnell's demand in the first place, much less why he would suggest that doing so provides the majority leader with leverage, quote unquote. Yeah. This may seem like a rather thin reed on which to hang high hopes, and it is. But if the outlook for filibuster abolition looks dim, Blue America's civil war over the issue is far from over. For the Democratic Party as an institution, the stakes of enacting major reforms over the next 2 years are nearly existential, and its leadership appears to understand this, even if its marginal senators do not. Here comes the People's Party, folks. Here comes the People's Party. The Democratic Party is in trouble, says Levitz. The basic problem facing the Democratic Party is simple. Barring an extraordinary change to America's political landscape, it will lose control of Congress in 2022 and have a difficult time regaining control for a decade thereafter. To be sure, the assumption that existing political trends will continue indefinitely has been leading pundits astray since the advent of our loathsome profession. And in certain respects, the future of our politics looks more uncertain than at any time in recent memory. For example, the fact that a critical mass of Republican voters now belong to the personality cult of a narcissistic con man who has no real investment in the conservative movement's well-being makes the prospect of the GOP fracturing more thinkable than it's been in about a century. This said, the trends bedeviling Democrats have been in motion for decades and are rooted in America's most durable political divides. To summarize the party's predicament, I think this is really a good piece of political analysis. As a result of 19th century efforts to gerrymander the Senate, the middle of our country is chock full of heavily white, low population rural states. This has always been a problem for the Party of Urban America. By boasting stronger support in rural areas, the Republicans have long punched above their weight in the race for control of state governments in the Senate. But for most of the 20th century, this advantage was mitigated by the Democrats' vestigial support in the post-Confederate South, and two, the ability to render local issues more salient than national ones in Senate elections. Over the past 2 decades, however, urban-rural polarization in the U.S. politics has reached unprecedented heights, while the collapse of local journalism and rise of the internet has made all politics national. Voters has never been less likely to split their tickets, and white rural areas have never been more likely to vote for Republicans. This is plausibly because the irreversible internet-induced nationalization of politics has increased rural white voters' awareness of the myriad ways that urban college-educated Democrats differ from them culturally. This is the case, and the Democratic Party may have only a limited ability to reverse urban-rural polarization in the near-term future. It took a series of minor miracles for the party to eke out its current 50-vote majority. By coincidence, Democrats happened to have their most vulnerable incumbent senators on the ballot 2 years ago, not in 2018, when the party rode anti-Trump fervor to one of the largest midterm landslides in American history. And yet, winning the House popular vote by 8.6% was not sufficient to prevent the party from losing Senate seats. And although John Tester and Joe Manchin won re-election in their deep red states both underperformed the national environment. In a year when the nation as a whole favored Democrats by more than 8 points, both Democratic incumbents won their races by a bit over 3 points. Which is to say, had those Democrats been on the ballot last year instead, when the national environment favored Democrats by only 4.4 points, they likely would have lost. Or to put the matter more pointedly, unless the Democratic nominee orchestrates an extraordinary landslide in 2024, Joe Manchin and John Tester will likely return to the private sector by the middle of the decade. Meanwhile, attempts to mint Joe Manchin's quote-unquote idiosyncratic Democrats whose strong local ties overwhelm the taint of the party's brand in white, and rural America have invariably failed in the post-Trump era. 2 years after Tester won his re-election in Montana, the state's Democratic governor, who arguably, Steve Bullock, was arguably more popular than Tester, did come within 10 points of winning his Senate seat in 2020. The party's outlook in the House of Representatives isn't much better. The abundance of predominantly white rural states doesn't just give the Republicans an advantage in the Senate. It also gives them an advantage in fights over redistricting. Since there are more solidly red states and there are solidly blue ones, Republicans have more opportunities to gerrymander House maps than Democrats do. What's more, even in the absence of gerrymandering, the convention of drawing geographically compact districts naturally underrepresents Democrats, since their support is more geographically concentrated in urban centers than the GOP support is in low-density areas. There is one reason why Democrats lost House seats in the 2020 election. Now, with the new census set to empower the GOP to produce an even more biased House map before 2022, Republicans have an excellent chance of retaking the House 2 years from now. And there's a graphic on this, which I'm not going to go through, but this is really inarguable. It's a graphic from 538 in Brookings. And Matt Iglesias has a redistricting bloodbath coming, a redistricting control map. The yellow states where redistricting is going to come about actually through a commission. So probably it's going to be more fair. Then there are purple states where things are split. There are blue states where Democrats will have control. There are only such blue states are only because California and New York, as states that are progressive, have now gone to commissions. So there won't be gerrymandering favoring the Democrats in those states anymore. But states where gerrymandering favoring the Democrats could still take place are in Delaware, in Maryland, in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in New Mexico, also Nevada, and Oregon. Those are the only states. On the other hand, that's what I mentioned, 6 or 7 states. They're at least simply eyeballing, the number of states here. There are at least 20 states where the Republicans have such a gerrymandering advantage. And that's why things will get even worse for the Democrats in terms of the House races. That's unless something is done. So what can be done? Also, this article illustrates the bias coming from the Electoral College and shows that the bias from the Electoral College gives the Republicans a 4% advantage over the Democrats. They can lose the Republicans the popular vote by 4% and still win the Electoral College. That's how bad that particular disadvantage is right now. So, if congressional Democrats don't go big, they will go home, says Levitz. He says the Constitution limits, he says to defy political gravity and fortify our democracy against the threat of authoritarian reaction. Dems need to either rebalance the electoral playing field through the passage of structural reforms or attain a degree of popularity that no in-power party has achieved in modern memory. And I don't think that Biden's going to do that unless he goes big. If the filibuster remains in place, doing the former will be impossible and the latter highly unlikely. The Constitution limits the Democrats' capacity to correct the biases of America's governing institutions, but the party could significantly reduce the overrepresentation of white rural America in the Senate by granting statehood to the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and any other U.S. territory that wants it. The party could also prohibit partisan redistricting, ban felon disenfranchise, erode practical barriers to the political participation of working class people and immigrants, make it easier for workers to form unions, which are both good for democracy and Democrats, grant citizenship to 11 million undocumented immigrants, impact the Supreme Court if it interferes with the implementation of these reforms. But none of these measures are going to attract 10 Republican votes in the Senate, and none of them are achievable through the budget reconciliation process. If Democrats do not pass structural reforms, their odds of retaining both chambers of Congress in 2022 aren't good. The president's party almost always loses seats in midterms. And due to the GOP structural advantages, even if Democrats were to replicate the Republican Party's post 9/11 performance in the 2002 elections, the only time this century that an empowered party gained ground, they might well still lose the House. All this said, Democrats could have some extraordinary wins at their back. Biden has a decent shot of presiding over a post-pandemic economic boom, to the extent that Democrats can juice that recovery with further growth and wage-boosting measures while maintaining the enthusiasm of their core interest groups. Thank you, honey. They may pull off the unprecedented in 2022, but it's hard to see how the party can do that while leaving the filibuster fully intact. Democrats would be incapable of honoring their now decades-old IOUs to civil rights organizations, labor unions, and immigrant communities if they allow the Senate's 60-vote threshold to remain in place. In a kinder political universe, Democratic control of the federal government would not be an aberration akin to a Buffalo Bills playoff win. In such a world, Democrats could pacify their core constituencies by pointing to the slimness of their current Senate majority and promising to deliver on their promises after they win more seats in 2022. In the world we actually live in, however, the NAACP and AFL-CIO have every reason to believe this is the last Democratic trifecta they're going to see in some time. Meanwhile, America's rising generations of millennials and Zoomers, who are both more left-wing than any of their predecessors and more distrustful of the major parties, are unlikely to grade the unified Democratic government on a curve. Keeping these cohorts invested in electoral politics and rooted in blue America is vital to the Democratic Party's medium-term prospects. If the Biden presidency features 2 years of tepid reform, followed by a midterm wipeout, younger left-leaning voters may grow disaffected with electoral politics. In this way, the GOP's structural advantages may be self-reinforcing. How many times can you watch your party win the popular vote but lose the election, and or win the presidency but fail to govern, before you stop bothering to cast a ballot? can only second this. This is brilliant analysis in this piece. All this makes it difficult for the Democratic leadership to accept the constraints that the filibuster and the ideological orientation of its marginal senators place on the prospects for reform. Only partisanship can save us now, says Levitz, and I completely agree. Following Manchin and Sinema's remarks Monday night, Schumer assured reporters, quote, "We are not letting McConnell dictate how the Senate operates," unquote. The majority leader then went on Maddow and vowed to pass major climate, racial justice, and democracy reform bills. His office, meanwhile, declared victory in the standoff with Mitch McConnell and promised to get big, bold things done for the American people. In the immediate term, the Democrats' internal conflict over the filibuster will move to the back burner. Joe Biden's COVID relief package and green infrastructure recovery plan consist primarily of tax and spending measures that the party can advance through the reconciliation process. And Schumer has signaled that he intends to bend the rules of that process as far as the Senate, the parliamentarian will let him. I have to add here, it's not up to the parliamentarian. It's up to the vice president, because the vice president can refuse to accept the advice of the parliamentarian. So Schumer can bend the rules of that process as far as the vice president and Joe Biden will let him, not as far as the parliamentarian, would let him. Besides, Schumer can fire the parliamentarian anytime he wants to, arguing that both the ban on new vehicles with internal combustion engines and a $15 an hour minimum wage are actually primarily means of reducing government spending when you really think about it. But why do we have to reduce government spending? There's no reason for it. But once reconciliation is done, then attention will turn to the large stack of Democratic coalition priorities, currently subject to a 60-vote requirement. It will not be easy for Schumer to tell the NAACP that his caucus values a Senate tradition that is anti-constitutional, historically associated with Jim Crow rule, and less than 2 decades old in its present form, more than it values a new Voting Rights Act. Nor will it be easy for the majority leader to tell organized labor that we'll just have to wait until next time to see a $15 an hour minimum wage, assuming that one doesn't get through the reconciliation process, or collective bargaining reform. And it might be hard for Schumer to accept that he probably won't ever wield majority power again after 2022, because his caucus would rather maintain the GOP structural advantage in the upper chamber than abolish the filibuster and add new states. I think that's brilliant in terms of exposing the forces on Schumer in this and exposing what his motivation is actually likely to be. Okay. We've pointed out that he might have a competitor in 2022 to run against, specifically AOC, and that he's afraid of that. But the even bigger point is that if he doesn't get the filibuster taken care of and get those structural changes made between now and 2022, he might just as well retire in 2022, because he really has no reason to be in the Senate anymore. If he can't be the majority leader and have that cap his career, why would he want to stay in the Senate? If he doesn't get the filibuster away and pass those bills to get rid of the Jim Crow stuff and to get rid of the gerrymandering and to get rid of the anti-labor stuff, if he doesn't get all that done by getting rid of the filibuster. His majority is toast in 2022, and he'll never be the majority leader again. And he has no reason to remain in the Senate at all. For these, anyway, that I've added that to this analysis. For these reasons, Schumer, a Senate Democrat whip Dick Durbin, and Delaware Senator and Biden confidant Chris Coons have all telegraphed an intention to eliminate the filibuster if Mitch McConnell obstructs their coalition's priorities. The apparent hope is that while Manchin, Sinema, and a few others support the filibuster in the abstract, in the heat of a legislative battle over voting rights or a $15 an hour minimum wage, they may consent to weakening the filibuster while lamenting what Mitch McConnell is making them do. Sinema and Manchin have repeatedly insisted they will not eliminate or get rid of the filibuster. But there are plenty of ways to erode the Senate 60-vote requirement that stops short of the abolition of the filibuster. You could create new exemptions modeled on reconciliation that allow for the passage of certain categories of legislation by simple majority vote. Or you could restore the requirement for those mounting a filibuster to speak continuously from the Senate floor, or you could throw every Democratic priority into a reconciliation bill and then let Kamala Harris overrule the parliamentarian when she exists. I'm so glad he got to that. But Manchin and company's cooperation with this scheme is far from assured. The Democratic Party has a vital interest in passing sweeping reforms that gratify its base and mitigate its structural disadvantages. But Joe Manchin doesn't necessarily have an interest in the institutional health of the Democratic Party. Our Republic's founders famously disdained political parties, and partisanship is a pejorative in contemporary American discourse, but our democracy's present affliction lies in the weakness of the parties, not in their strength. Were the GOP a stronger institution, the Trump presidency would never have happened. With the Democratic leadership capable of formulating and enforcing a party line, the filibuster would not be long for this earth. While the Constitution failed to stymie the advent of political parties, it has kept them weaker than their overseas analogs. The Democratic Party is more of a loose association of elected office holders than a coherent mass member organization. As such, it has limited capacity to dictate terms to any of its incumbent senators, let alone to those whose job security would be enhanced by becoming Republicans. If Joe Manchin votes to abolish the filibuster, he will increase his personal power, but also likely expose himself to a series of can't-win votes on legislation that divides his idiosyncratic voting base of Democrats and right-leaning independents. A strong Democratic Party may be capable of brokering a deal between its moderate senators, interest groups, and activists, e.g., will abolish the filibuster if you'll focus your advocacy on a discrete set of mutually agreeable issues and pork for our home states. The existing Democratic Party probably can't. Thus, the Democrats' existential interest in eroding the filibuster remains on a collision course with its moderate senators' aversion to power. Anyone with a fondness for democracy must hope that against all odds, the forces of partisanship will prevail. I think that is one great analysis, and I wanted very much to present it to you. It's well worth thinking about, especially in the context of the earlier article from Damon Mathis, I guess his name was, concerning the advantages to those who want to operate in a bipartisan way if you do get rid of the filibuster. It's interesting to look at those two articles in juxtaposition. I think these are articles that should be sent to Joe Manchin and to Kristen Sinema, both, and see what they think. There are 2 articles that they should read. Well, I have one more thing to cover today before, okay, I go to your thing. Bonnie's taking a deep breath. I know she's taking a deep breath. But this one is another really great one that you need to be aware of. This is from the week 2, and it's from my favorite author there, who by now, it's not from my favorite author there, but it's still good. It's 5 wacky things that Senate Democrats will do instead of ending the filibuster. And it's by John Walker, who I do know from old Fire Dog the Fire Dog Lake days, and who is a good writer, okay, and a good analyst, though it took him some time to come around to Medicare for All. I think he's probably only just there as of a few years ago. He was a public option type back in 2009 and 2010, when we had a number of arguments in print about that. But in the interim, he's become a little bit of an MMTer and much more inclined, okay, to Medicare for All. But anyway, this is a good piece. Basically, okay, it's on the theme that he thinks the next 2 years in politics are going to be largely focused on the bizarre and often convoluted ways Democrats can pass their agenda without Republican support and without officially ending the filibuster. Here are 5 ranked by likelihood. 1, fire the parliamentarian. There are multiple catches to using reconciliation. The first is that Congress can pass only 1 or 2 such bills a year. The second is every part of the bill needs to obey the Byrd rule, requiring provisions to be related to the budget. If something doesn't change federal spending or revenue, or if the change it produces is merely incidental, if a provision is extraneous, in other words, in either of those cases, it's considered to be extraneous. If a provision is extraneous, it can be removed by a senator raising a point of order. So who decides if raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is budgetary or merely incidental to the budget? The vice president, with the advice of the parliamentarian of the Senate. Democrats don't think the parliamentarian is taking an expansive enough view of what is or is not related to the budget. They can fire the parliamentarian and replace them with someone who takes a different view. This, in fact, is exactly what the Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott did in 2001, the last time the Senate was split 50-50, and the Republicans wanted to move a bill via reconciliation. He fired the parliamentarian, and he hired one that he thought would rule in favor of the GOP tax cuts, which they passed using reconciliation back then. Number 2, have Vice President Kamala Harris overrule the parliamentarian for reconciliation. What makes firing the parliamentarian weird is they technically have no official power in this matter. By tradition, the parliamentarian advises on what is or is not extraneous, and that advice is followed. But technically, the decision ultimately rests with the presiding officer. The presiding officer would be Vice President Kamala Harris, since she is president of the Senate. Harris cannot simply ignore the parliament, can simply ignore the parliamentarian and decide no provisions are extraneous. After all, basically every policy will have at least some impact on the federal budget. Senators can appeal her decisions, but it takes 60 votes to overrule her. As long as Harris and 41 Democrats want a provision included, 50 Democrats are prepared to vote for the final package. They can pass anything with reconciliation. 3, decide certain issues aren't subject to the filibuster. Joe Manchin has been very clear that he wants to keep the legislative filibuster because he thinks it promotes compromise. But it is possible the party might consider making some new special carve-outs. Several actions are already exempt from the filibuster. There are, of course, the budget reconciliation bills, and senators can't filibuster attempts to use the Congressional Review Act to overturn some regulations. In 2013, Democrats removed the filibuster for most presidential appointments after the Republicans repeatedly blocked the nominees of the president. Similarly, in 2017, the GOP got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. It is possible moderate Senate Democrats could be convinced to exempt other actions while keeping the legislative filibuster. Last month, when Senator Mitch McConnell was holding up the organizing resolution for the new Senate, it was suggested that Democrats should use a mini nuclear option to end the filibuster only for organizing resolutions. One could also make a compelling argument that statehood resolutions are not actually actually legislation, and so should be exempt from the filibuster, or that reforms that relate only to the House of Representatives, ending gerrymandering, expanding the number of House seats, shouldn't be subject to the Senate filibuster, or even something as small as just shortening the amount of Senate floor time that different procedural matters take. 4, you could force the filibusterers to talk. Okay, I talked about this earlier, so I am just going to skip this, okay, because I talked about that. It's possible. So then 5th, lock them in the Senate chamber. I hadn't thought of this one. There is a reason the two-speech rule has rarely been enforced to try to break a filibuster. Let me go back again to the two-speech rule. Under the Senate rules, each senator must be recognized to speak if they wish and can talk for as long as they are able, but they may only offer 2 speeches on each issue. Democrats could try to aggressively enforce this rule and bend norms by setting a new precedent that any recognition of any senator for any reason is a speech. So that's what the two-speech rule is and how it could be changed. Now, there is a reason for the two-speech rule has rarely been enforced to try to break a filibuster. Senators can use other delay tactics, so they don't need to actually hold the floor in a grueling marathon of talking. Senate precedent holds that a parliamentary inquiry and suggesting the absence of a quorum don't count as one of the 2 speeches. So to tie up the Senate, one senator just needs to constantly suggest the absence of a quorum, requiring a majority of senators to be gathered before anything further can be done. That was a tactic, in other words, to actually prevent a quorum, was a tactic senators once used to stop bills from going forward. That's why in 1877 the Senate changed the rules to allow the sergeant at arms and doorkeeper to arrest senators and physically force them to come to the Senate. Democrats could, in theory, decide to reinterpret these rules to require the sergeant at arms to effectively lock all the senators in the chamber until the pending bill is voted for. This would turn a subsequent filibuster into a painful game of chicken, hoping the other side slips up or breaks first. Talk about diapers in the Senate. That one would take diapers in the Senate. All it takes is a determined majority, says John Walker. All these ideas may seem weird and convoluted and even stupid because they are. Of course, the same can be said about the U.S. Senate. And the only reason we're talking about these workarounds is because enough senators want to keep it that way. The important thing is these are just some of the entirely viable ways for unified and determined Democrats to pass whatever they want with a simple majority. Ultimately, the rules of the Senate are whatever the vice president plus 50 senators say they are. So Democrats can get around any filibuster for policies they truly care about, even if they insist on, quote, keeping the legislative filibuster. They can do it by bending the rules of reconciliation or by turning the filibuster into some grueling, months-long endurance challenge which eventually ends, or by redefining the filibuster in some completely new way. All it takes is the will and a plan. That is all it takes. So this live stream has been about the filibuster, okay, and reconciliation and getting over barriers and passing the kinds of bills Biden and the Democrats need to pass to avoid defeat in 2022 and to avoid the return of a Republican Party, which might cause another fascist to be nominated and to win the election for president in 2024. So these are the things which a Democratic Party can and must do. Now I will move to your comments. Whose words are we marking here? Okay, so Stacey Van Veen says Romney, Mr. 47%. Yes. And Joanne says, anyone see Michael Moore's video to force corporations retool to produce COVID vaccines? No, I haven't seen that as yet, but now that you mention it, I will make sure to see it. And Steve Wolfbrand says panquake.com, new social media platform from Susie Dawson and Bill Burney. Please check it out and donate if you can. Okay. And Steve Wolfbrand says, yep. Stacey Van Veen says, Fauci was just on Chris Hayes, poo-pooing the utilization of new manufacturing facilities for vaccines, saying it's too complicated and the inspection regime is too lengthy, so we would have everybody vaccinated by the time a new factory came online. He may or may not be right, but if he is right, then I think what the federal government should do is to simply use the Defense Production Act to seize control of the Pfizer and the Pfizer factories, okay, and the Moderna factories, and the Johnson & Johnson factories, okay, and any other factories that are in operation now, to ensure that those factories all produce vaccines as quickly as they can and offer the vaccines at low prices, okay, or for free, with the assistance of the federal government. State says, I'm not a fan of Fauci. He's an asshole. He stole the AIDS test from the French, okay, and patented it. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Fauci either, because I know that he lied to us, okay, at the beginning concerning masks. He chose to try to manipulate us instead of telling the truth about what the masks could do. This has cost lives. Steve Wolfbrand says $2,000. It's not $1,400, right? And Joanne says federal job guarantee now. Steve Wolfbrand says, ridiculous. The Chinese built an entire hospital in 1 week. Says the Chinese would have executed Trump and his lethal friends by now, too. And Steve says, Biden lied about stimulus checks. We'll be lucky to get 1,000. No, we won't, Steve. We won't be lucky to get 1,000. We'll be lucky to get 2,000. And we've got to insist on the 2,000. And if we don't get to 2,000, it's got to be all over the internet that that's the first big failure of the Biden administration and the first big broken promise of the Biden administration. By the way, I'm not even sure that's the first. There probably others too that I'm just not thinking about right now.
That's a good one.
And Lana says, hi, folks. Bonnie says, that's a good one. Yeah, I think that's a good one, too. Kay says, I like the idea of a wealth tax, though. So do I, but not to raise revenue. As long as you do the wealth tax and you go forward kicking and screaming, we're not putting this on to raise revenue. We're putting this on to protect our democracy. Steve Wolfbrand says 90%. Steve Gonzo says the Senate has voted 50 to 49 in favor of moving the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package toward using budget reconciliation. No Republicans voted for the resolution, but evidently one Republican was not there to vote or did not vote. That's interesting, because that means that Harris did not have to break a tie. So that's interesting. Who was the Senate? Who was the Republican in the Senate who missed the vote? That's what I'd like to know. Stacey Van Veen says, fuck the Republicans. They are seditionist traitors. They are. 147 of them in the House were. Certainly. And 8 of them in the Senate certainly were. But a lot more than 8 are defending the seditionists. 45 of them just defended the chief seditionist. Kay says, I like Carter. Yeah, I like him a lot better now than I liked him when he was president. Steve Wolfbrand says, 40 years, that's a lot of bad government. That's what we've had, 40 years of neoliberal government. Kay says, too many years, Steve. Kay says, there many people do listen to him. No, I know. It's because the mass media has built this fable around him, basically defending him as a good president and just never pointing out what the dynamics might have been in 2009 and later. Steve Gonzo says, new census data show that almost half of the families Democrats are now threatening to cut out $2,000 checks have been economically crushed by the pandemic. Yeah. So maybe now Democrats aren't going to threaten to cut them out, because I don't think Democrats are yet quite threatening to cut them out. That's been part of the talk. It was the Republicans who wanted to cut them out, okay, and the Democrats who have been saying, okay, well, listen, we're open-minded when it comes to the idea of maybe restricting the eligibility somewhat on this. But Democrats have not made a strong commitment, okay, to do this. If there is new census data that shows that this would be deleterious for the Democratic Party, I don't think they'll go that way. They know they're really on the margins here, and they have to watch out for that. And Joanne says, Steve Wolfbrand, no, Skungle Dessert says, hello, do you like the Jamaican clan? Do you like the Jamaican missile deal? What the hell is that? Stacey Van Veen says, nobody cares if stuff is bipartisan except the Democrats in office. Okay, the Democrats certainly don't. And then one Trodden Sherman says, give me $5. I'm the better person here. You agree. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. Pooh thought I'd give you 5 Jamaican mafia dollars. Ha ha ha. Give me $5. Alana says, what missile deal? That's a troll. We got a troll. And Steve Gonzo says, Warren Gunnels today, Budget Committee Chair Sanders introduced $1.9 trillion budget resolution allowing the Senate to boost direct payments to $2K, provide $400 a week to the unemployed, raise the minimum wage to $15, prevent the mass layoffs and more. Scrungle Delights has replied, I'm going to ignore Scrungle Delights. I'm not going through the comments of Scrungle Delights and the other troll on here. Steve Gago says the U.S. Air Force dispatched another pair of long-range nuclear-capable B-52 bombers over the Middle East on Tuesday as the presidential administration of Joe Biden looks to approach negotiations with Iran. And Lana says, troll alert. Steve says, not a lot of brain cells left in that Biden. Cabeza. And Lana says, my usual YouTube buddy is not with us tonight. I've shared on Twitter and several groups. Not sure, okay, where everyone is tonight. Steve says, thank you, Lana. Steve says, panquake.com, check it out. Steve Gonzo says, loco en la cabeza. Kay says, hopefully Bernie can make some sense out of this mess. Shake my head. And Lana says, was Stiglitz with Mehdi? I missed it. Yes, he was with Mehdi. Steve Wolfbrand said, there were a lot of progressives going live tonight, competition. Lana says, Steve Wolfbrand, aha, that must be it. Kay says, probably on YouTube, Lana. Kay says, where is Evelina Pond? Steve says, haven't seen Carmen Munez in a while either, probably phone problems. No, Carmen has been in Facebook jail. And I was able to communicate with Carmen just yesterday, and she still had 10 days left to go in Facebook jail, sadly. Kay says, I just messaged the link to Evelina. Thank you. Steve says, I can't believe you still have faith in Biden, Doc. Disappointing. I don't have faith in Biden. Why do you think I have faith in Biden? I don't have faith in Biden to do anything except what Biden perceives is in his interest at the time. That's the only faith I have in Biden. And I don't have that much faith because of his capacity to make errors, which means he often probably does not know what is in his interest. Steve, he's all we have now. And Diaz says, just checking by. I'm back at work. Can't attend. Smooches. Thank you, dear. Steve Wolfbrand says, well, maybe we can slide by on my good looks. Steve and Kay says, I call him Obama. So do I. And Stacy says, Obama sucks. And Barbara Wernick says, his kill count is obscene. And Ricky Rand says, hey, Ricky. And Steve Wolfbrand said, haha, let's see a pic. Laugh out loud. Actually, Kay, it was Evelina who said, Steve Wolfbrand, ha ha ha, let's see a pic. And Kay says, hi, Evelina, glad to see you. And Evelina says, hey, Kay, glad to be here. And Steve says, Kay was looking for you. They're going with reconciliation. Yeah, Bernie is rubbing his hands together. It's going to be reconciliation. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrandt, you weren't. Steve Wolfbrandt says, I get compared to Brad Pitt a lot. Yeah, you may get compared to Brad Pitt a lot, but the question is, what is the nature of the comparison? Kay says, let's see you, Steve, laugh out loud. Steve Wolfbrandt says, really, really, look at that. Let's see a profile pic. Evelina says, then. And Lana says, hi again. Hi, Lana, you're back on YouTube. And Steve says, happening now, the remains of Officer Brian Sicknick, who was killed in the January 6th riot, lies in honor at the United States Capitol. Evelina says, Schumer is a shrewd politician. Nobody has ever accused him of not being shrewd. What they've accused him of is being a gutless politician. Now let's see whether that particular accusation continues to hold water. I mean, maybe he will have found some guts now that he finally has his chance to be the majority leader of the Senate. He's been waiting for that for a long time. Maybe we will see a new Chuck Schumer. Maybe we are seeing a new Chuck Schumer. We will see. Steve says Biden will never sign that reconciliation shit. And he says, mark my words. Steve, you are wrong about that. If the Democrats pass a reconciliation bill and it comes to his desk, he certainly will sign it, especially since most of it is going to be his bill, the bill he says he wants. He's going to sign it, Steve. Evelina says, Schumer's a shrewd politician. Doesn't mean I like him, though. And Barbara Werner says, they brought it to the floor today. The Republicans said no. Dems are going reconciliation. Yeah, well, they have the authority to go reconciliation now. What they'll probably do is to say, okay, we have the authority. It's right there. We're starting our committees working on it. They're working on reconciliation. Unless you want a reconciliation bill to pass, if you want to have a hand in the bill that does pass, you better be willing to compromise. You better be willing to mobilize at least your 10 votes in favor of a 60-vote bill. So if you don't do that, we're going reconciliation. Kay says, yes, I saw that, Steve Gonzo. So what the Democrats are doing now is they're using reconciliation as leverage. Steve Wolfbrandt said, good guy, too bad. Barbara says, the most fight I've seen from Dems in years. Barbara says, get those checks out. Yeah, they're too long in coming already. They're too long in coming already. In fact, I think they should be 2,000 plus another 1,000 because they're too long in coming.
Maybe we should sue them.
Steve says, I'm not so vain as to post a profile pic, but if you go to photos, I'm riding a horse shirtless on a beach. Happy now, laugh out loud, JK. And Kay says, rum provided that corporate Dems are dying as a party. They better work hard. Barbara Wernick says, wrong. Steve Gonzo says, Steve likes to poke the bear. Yeah. Evelina says, let them. Barbara Wernick says, the Dems can't die. The Republicans are dead. Who will we vote for? Don't worry. A new and improved coalition, the People's Party or others. Kay says, People's Party. Would be great to vote for someone I actually wanted to vote for. Evelina says, I wish the corporate Dems would leave and join the Republicans. Then we can have something akin to the People's Party inside the Dems. Maybe if the Republican Party splits, then some of the corporate Dems will leave and join the Republicans. Evelina says, inside the Dem Party. And Steve says, Joe Biden's releasing held funds for Puerto Rico. Great. Evelyn says, good news. Kay says, yes, very good news, Steve Gonzo. Kay says, they're dragging the 15-hour wage for several years anyhow, which sucks bad. It does. They're dragging it to 4 years. It's only going to get there in 2025. By 2025, we're going to need a 25-hour an hour wage, $25 an hour wage. Mark my words. By 2025, that's what we're going to need. Evelyn says not nearly enough anyway. Might as well give them something to really bitch about and ask for $20 an hour. I stick with my proposal, which is basically, well, let's see what I feel like today. $18 an hour in the lowest cost area of the United States. Cost adjusted upward using the CPI. Using the CPI. It would be at least $30 an hour in New York City. That would come to at least $30 an hour in expensive cities like New York City. Kay says, I agree, Evelyn. Evelyn should be at least 20-hour minimum. Give them something to really bitch about. Kay says, haven't heard a damn thing about expanding Social Security since he was elected either. That is the only reason I voted for him. Kay says, I'm sick to death of having to be means tested for every little bit of help I get by being a poor senior. Evelina says, I like that one. Fire the parliamentarian, laugh out loud. Kay says, give me the money and single payer, I'm good to go. Evelina says, it's miserable and very mean. Evelina says, not asking too much. Kay says, yes, it sure is. Food stamps coming up on February 9th. Deborah says, I apologize. I was not present tonight, but my friend has a documentary on Bernie's loss, and it was just released, so I watched it. Well, post the link here, Deborah, so we can all watch it. And Deborah, I missed. And Kay says, so I watched it. And I said, okay, Deborah, post it. Evelina says, hi, Deborah. Steve Wolfman says, no problem. Deborah Wilson says, also good luck with Joe Biden, like I've said from a long time ago. Deborah says, yeah, hi. Kevin St. Ford said, that can't be right. It will take until year's end to vaccinate everyone. They can't get factories up inside of a year. But Ricky says, so many open spaces. I don't really believe them. I think they can. I think they can stand a factory up within 3 or 4 months. They don't have to get a new factory up. Press General Motors into service with their assembly line. They'll have an assembly line up within 2 months. No problem. And Ricky Rand says, so many open spaces. Steve Volkran said, Panquake is a very exciting new platform. It's all over progressive independent media. I'll take a look. And Ricky Rand says there's a lot of inspections and strict the requirements, but they could have started last year. No, they couldn't because Donald Trump was president and he would not take advantage of the law. Evelina says, I read they were going to distribute vaccines in certain select pharmacies. I wonder which ones. The big chains, let me guess, the big chains. Yes, it was. They had some deal going with CVS and Walgreens to vaccinate, in nursing homes. But evidently, thus far, that's been a big failure. Adia Swift says, quick note while I'm on break, B.1.1.7 has mutated and is vaccine resistant. Which vaccine is it resistant? Evelina says, thanks for the tip. How can the impeachment trial be unconstitutional? It is demanded in the Constitution with no exceptions. They're arguing that uh, the impeachment clause does not explicitly say anywhere that you can impeach somebody who is already out of office. Uh, but there is precedent for that. They have impeached and convicted somebody in the post-Civil War period, okay, who was out of office. They impeached him, I believe, for violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. He was not a former president. He was a former cabinet member, if I recall correctly. With respect to its being unconstitutional, this is even more problematic, okay, than that, because even though Donald Trump is out of office, his impeachment did not occur when he was out of office. His impeachment occurred when he is in office. The Senate trial is occurring when he is out of office. So it doesn't seem to me there's grounds for saying that this conviction, that somehow there shouldn't be a conviction trial. There's still grounds for saying that the trial for his conviction ought to go on, because if his conviction occurs, then they can impose as a penalty that he cannot hold office again in the United States. Steve Gonzo says, they'll just argue the Constitution is unconstitutional. There's no judge. Steve Gonzo said, Steve's 12 monkeys, Brad. Kim says, every month is White History Month. And Lana Dell says, in the meantime, some of the moderate Republicans are joining the Democrats. Are you talking about with respect to impeachment? Yes, that has happened. Stacey Van Veen says, Biden just set a deadline for a COVID relief bill, March 14th. So people are going to wait because Congress always waits until the 11th hour. Well, that's a function of reconciliation. If they could have gotten rid of the filibuster, they wouldn't have had to have waited so long. But the reconciliation bill is going to take a long time to go through, especially because the conviction trial is going to be going through at the same time. Steve Gonzo says, here's your deadline, Biden. 457,856 fatalities from COVID. Yeah, that's the figure from the Worldometer site. At the end of today, 457,856. Right. And something like, I believe it's 1,376 deaths per million now. Evelina says poignant. And Steve says, panquake.com, Doc, you got to get on board. I will check it out. Deborah Wilson says, she gives a link to Facebook. Oh, thank you, Deborah. I suspect that's for the documentary on Facebook. Evelina says, can you comment on the Myanmar coup and the woman who was deposed, arrested? Thanks. The only comment, I can make is that, let's see if I can pronounce her name correctly, Mong Song Ki, something like that. I'd have to read it again. So she replaced, the military dictatorship. And for a time, she was revered by people because she had gone through imprisonment, in isolation for quite a long period of time. And people thought that she was sort of another Mandela. But turned out she wasn't. In office, she was quite a tyrannical leader, as far as I understand. And so the military has decided to take matters in their own hands. I don't know why they did it. The military is very corrupt. And so they would do it just for the hell of it, to be in a better position to profit from it. So I don't know. But the idea that this woman should be defended on grounds of democracy, that is, I don't agree with that idea, because she has been anything but a respecter of democracy as a leader, of Myanmar during this period. So supporting her, against the military coup is not supporting democracy. If I were the United States, the problems of democracy are here. Let us take care of our own problems of democracy first before we get involved in Myanmar's democratic problems. My share of Brandon DeGraff's flawless coverage of Bernie's takedown by the Democrat shenanigans. And thank you very much. But I don't think they were shenanigans. I think they were frauds. Evelina says, good comment, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Evelina. Okay. I think I've caught up to all the comments. I think that kind of does it for tonight. I hope you liked the program tonight. I think that the stuff I went over in many cases was really outstanding stuff and should give you a lot of food for thought and a lot of material for Twitter, as well. So have a very good evening. I will be back tomorrow night with some more. I have a lot of other good things to talk about. I've also got some short takes to make. I haven't had the time to make them, but I have so many backed up, it's not even funny. So hopefully I'll get some time and start getting some in the pot there over the next a few days. But certainly I will be here tomorrow night in the usual spot. So thank you, Deborah, for coming. Thank you, Kay, for coming. And good night, everybody.